Welcome. You're going to start. Yeah. It is now your full screen. Oh, yes.
Can you see me okay? Can everybody hear me?
Perfect.
Okay. So thank you and looking forward to this. I particularly appreciated Maurice's and other focus with respect to meta-cybernetics because it addresses a couple of key points that I'm interested in a lot of my work over the last 45, 50 years, but especially over the last couple of years. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the nature of cybernetics and why I find it useful. And with respect to the Anthropocene, and central to all of it is a notion of human agency and how human cyberneticity enables human agency, not only from a scientific, but to an historical perspective. So let me get into this. I've got 6 sets of slides with some key points. Happy to discuss any of them. As with any of us who have been doing cybernetics and systems for a long time, we recognize that the distinctions that are made by the observer, in this case me, these are distinctions that I find significant and very helpful for me. Question of where you draw the boundaries and what you find important reflects the interests of the particular people involved, etc. So I'm going to go over these relatively briefly because I think they're more of a summary, and then we can discuss as people see fit. The first point I'd make is that I think there's a whole variety of what can be called the system sciences that I would include as general systems approaches, cybernetics, system dynamics, systems engineering, complex systems theory, and in particular network theory. Those are all part of a broad set of system sciences which are comparable to biological sciences, physical sciences, social sciences, etc. I think all of them are meta paradigms in the sense for transdisciplinary science and praxis. I'm sensitive to the point that Larry made in his presentation a couple of weeks ago. I view this in a sense of humility, not in the sense that every other paradigm and every other field is subordinate to the system sciences, but that they are meta paradigms because they transcend and cover lots of different kinds of phenomena that people are interested in looking at. So they're relevant to the physical sciences, the social sciences, the biological sciences, the practical sciences, etc. For me, cybernetics is arguably the most important and powerful because it's a science and praxis of purposeful action. I know that there were original emphases at the Macy conferences that addressed things like circular causality and self-organization, and those have been major themes ever since the late 40s. But fundamentally, I think the primary value of cybernetics, because it focuses attention on purposeful behavior, not only the science of it, but also the praxis of it, and in particular, effective purposeful action. It's not just enough to be purposefully oriented, but you have to actually get things done. So you start getting into issues of agency, et cetera. For me, cyberneticity is the science behind self-organizing agency and autonomy. That's not only biological autonomy, but also social autonomy. And to the extent that we're beginning to develop some technologies that have autonomous or semi-autonomous capabilities, that reflects degrees of cyberneticity as well. It's not simple, it's not straightforward, there's very multi-dimensional. But for the paradigm as a whole, as with any paradigm, I don't find distinctions like first-order cybernetics and second-order cybernetics as helpful as other people might find. I think I understand them conceptually, I understand them historically. I find it more helpful to recognize that in any paradigm, and in particular within cybernetics and other system sciences, that there are multidimensional features that reflect basic philosophical distinctions. So they have epistemological perspectives and features, they have ontological features, they have methodological features, they have axiological features, and they have teleological features. And that runs the gamut from science to praxis. And I think each of those features are particularly important. I think different parts of the fields within the system sciences emphasize different features more than others. I think they're all particularly helpful. But for me, cybernetics, and I'm going to talk cybernetics and system science. I'll probably use the language just cybernetics here for shortness of the presentation. But it's extremely useful and it's extremely powerful as a meta paradigm because it's allowed me to go into almost anything in terms of from a scientific perspective or from an applied perspective and ask some really important key questions in no matter what the nature of the subject matter, no matter who we're talking with or whatever else. So for me, it's been extremely useful. My original doctoral work was in Russian studies, and I stumbled onto systems and cybernetics when I was in grad school, and it was important enough and seductive enough that I shifted my entire emphasis, even before I finished my dissertation, from Russian studies to cybernetics and system sciences. My focus over the career has been on as a professor and a practitioner. So it's my focus and my priorities are enhancing human affairs in some manner, shape, or form. And I'm using enhancing rather than improving. I know it's a fine distinction on the language. Improving is generally taking something that's not working quite so well and making it better. Enhancing generally refers to something that's already working well and making it even better than when it's working well. And I think for the most part, in human history, we've done some pretty amazing things without getting cocky about it. But obviously there's some trouble in paradise. And so my focus right now has been on the nature of the Anthropocene. I think the Anthropocene is probably the best term that summarizes sort of the current nature of the human condition, the emergence of modern humanity. I know that the term was originally developed by the geoscientists to talk about the impact of human activities on the physical planet, but it has begun to gradually at least compared to since 20 years ago, 30 years ago when it was first proposed, become a general term. It's sort of talking about describing the current human condition with respect to basically primarily focusing on what I would call planet-centric trends. From my standpoint, it's important to look at both the combination of people-centric trends and issues and benefits, but also the planet-centric ones. So this is not just about climate change. It's not just about pandemics. It's not just about species extinction. The two sets of graphs to the left, the graphics are probably familiar to many of you. The basically showing human trends. The top one are the human or the people-centric. The bottom are the planetary-centric. But what the most important point of it is that almost all the trends, at least over the last 150 to 200 years, have shown dramatic increases. These are what are known as hockey stick graphs by people who work in the field. And if everybody who's involved in today understands this, then I don't want to repeat it, but a lot of other people and a lot of the other audiences that I make these presentations to and have started developing on this project, this is new to them. It's well known within people focusing on the Anthropocene. It's not well known outside of that. I think there have been all kinds of meta causes that have occurred that have led to a dramatic change in human activities, and that these have included both in significantly enhanced opportunities and benefits in terms of human progress. And I would argue over the last 500 years, and I will make that point in a moment, but also significant emerging challenges that haven't been as appreciated until recently. The most critical meta change has been a fundamental alteration in the relationship between the species and the planet, between humanity and the planet. And this was an issue that Gregory Bateson took up at the conference in Austria in 1967, 1968, that I had sort of forgotten about, except that Klaus had a chance comment in one of the presentations, and it jogged my memory to go back and take a look at Mary Catherine Bateson's coverage of that conference. But again, the central focus was on what are the downsides of conscious human purposeful behavior. And I think it's not only conscious, but unconscious. But fundamentally, we're at a point now where we are jeopardizing the human habitability of the planet Earth. I can remember when in the 60s, when going to undergrad school and then grad school in the early 70s, there were bumper stickers that says, you know, save the planet. Well, the planet's going to be fine. It just may not be the kind of planet that is particularly conducive to the kind of life that human beings have developed over, in particular, the last 12,000 years, and especially over the last 500 years. So if we want to understand the nature of the Anthropocene, my focus has been on recognizing that you need to understand both the science of it and the history of it. And most scientists, including most people working as system scientists or cyberneticians, pay relatively little explicit focus to history. And most historians pay very little attention to science. And I think you need to understand both. So my focus on this project of Homo Cyberneticus, which I've named because I think the single most important characteristic defining the species is not that we're so wise, it's that we're so purposeful and we have the ability to organize not only our own activities, but also increasingly the nature of our natural environment, which includes living systems and non-living systems. And I think that is the really critical forcing function that has led to the emergence of the Anthropocene. So hence the term Homo Cyberneticus. We can add it to all the other variations that people have offered over the years, like Homo economicus and et cetera. So talk a little bit about human cyberneticity. I think this is the critical feature of humanity. I think there are lots of other characteristics that are also important, but the key that I found particularly relevant is that human cyberneticity is the most insignificant emergent phenomenon in the known universe. There may be other species, there may be other kinds of phenomena, we don't know about them. I do think there is just an exponential difference in human cyberneticity compared to other kinds of cyberneticity that has been evidenced by living systems and even in our technologies. And the reason is that this enables multidimensional agency and autonomy. And agency is the ability to act, and autonomy is the ability to act independent of specific external constraints. Doesn't mean you're completely unaffected by them, because we're interrelated, interconnected, but it's the autonomy is the independence of specific actions. And this cyberneticity enables the agency and the autonomy. There are obviously varying degrees of how complex and how capable, but the key result of it in terms of the capability is that it allows human beings to transcend various kinds of constraints that affect everything else in the universe. And the most fundamental of those are physical. It can be gravity, it can be thermodynamics, it can be other things. So biologically, our biological cyberneticity allows us to transcend these physical constraints, but then it also, as it has evolved as a species, by social constraints and other kinds of various constraints. And so brings up the point that we'll talk about a little bit later with respect to why the importance of the law of requisite variety, because the law of requisite variety addresses the relative ability to address particular kinds of constraints and the variety of those constraints and what it takes to be able to do it. So human cyberneticity reflects what I would argue has developed into very sophisticated organizing capabilities. And this is not only organizing capabilities for self-organization, but also for other organization to a degree that no other phenomenon has demonstrated. Obviously, beavers and ants and others can affect their environment and can affect their other members of their species, but that's relatively limited. Human beings have this enormous capacity for organizing ourselves somewhat biologically, but especially socially, but in particular, our ability to organize elements of our natural or the physical environment on planet Earth. And these are really, really profound, and they have been evolving significantly, especially over the last 500 years. So this ability, in turn, anything that enhances our capabilities, our cyberneticity, I think is important, and that involves social dimensions and environmental dimensions and technological dimensions and neurological. Ideas matter, hence Homo sapiens, but ideas aren't enough. You have to be able to translate them into something. A classic example that grabs people's attention when I talk to other kinds of audiences is there's been speculation that porpoises, for example, are as intelligent as human beings. And that may well be the case. We haven't been able to demonstrate that one way or the other. But I do know that you can't build or make or organize other things very well with flippers. You can with hands. You can do other things, collaboration, et cetera. So since cybernetics is the science and praxis of effective, purposeful action, our ability has become very, very sophisticated, especially over the last 12,000 years. And 10,000 BCE has been established by people who are far more expert in these matters than I am as sort of the beginnings of when human beings, I would argue, became clearly Homo Cyberneticus. And it's because they started then manipulating agricultural and developing things. They weren't just living off the land. They started manipulating, cross-fertilizing, et cetera. And you've had the beginning of farming, which then led to agriculture and everything else. So over the last 12,000 years, there's been this increasing and expanding effects of human cyberneticity at the local level, and then at the regional level, and then increasingly at the global level. So it used to be pockets of human beings around the planet, and now we're obviously more and more tightly connected. And I think that is a major characteristic of life in the Anthropocene. So creating the Anthropocene. Obviously, these distinctions reflect my perspective, a lot of data, a lot of research. There's no one date that says, okay, all of a sudden the Anthropocene started. There's certainly been a huge amount of human progress over the last 12,000 years. But if you look at a graph, and I was going to put it in here, I use it in other presentations, but if you look at the development of human activities and population and increasing prosperity, because they're clearly very closely linked. For 11,500 years, it's relatively flat. I know there was China and ancient Greece and Rome and, various degrees of increasing sophistication and civilization in the Africas and the Americas, but, and to them, it was significant progress. But if you look at, from our perspective here in 2021, and that everything is relatively flat until the early 1800s, and then it goes through the roof. It's a giant hockey stick. And so this transformational increase took time, but the real turning point occurred when you had the development or the discovery of the New World, the Americas, which also then was occurring with the development of new knowledge, but in particular, it triggered new knowledge. The discovery of the Americas by the Western Europeans directly contributed to the scientific revolution. And the scientific revolution was a key breakthrough because it helped us human beings begin to develop more accurate information about how our world on planet Earth works, including human beings in it. So this led to more and more accurate and increased capabilities. There are general trends that I go into in the project in a lot more detail. But in essence, these trends over the last 500 years has been an increased emphasis on connecting with other elements of human beings around the planet, globalizing early, understanding scientific revolution, liberating the application of the scientific revolution through the Enlightenment to increasing human freedoms, which gets directly into the effects of autonomy and agency, and increased prospering. There's a lot of emphasis. People will talk about different phases of globalization and modernization. I think many people who are working in the areas of the Anthropocene really don't start dating it until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. More recent work has been emphasizing that it's really occurred since what has been known as the Great Acceleration, which is after World War II. And if you look at the effects, I would say that's a good place to start the Anthropocene. But one of the things you find when you're looking at including the scientific and the historical roots of it, it's not just when do you start seeing the effects, it's when do you start seeing the beginning of a substantial shift in activities and capabilities that began to generate the kinds of changes and it took a while to build up steam. And I think you can lay out the case pretty strongly that it started 1492, but 1500's easier for most people to remember. But it started having major effects, and there have been at least 4 distinct phases that I've been able to decipher that are meaningful. And modernization 1 or globalization 1 is roughly 1500 to 1800. It was dominated by the scientific revolution and driven by that. Modernization 2 was from roughly 1800 to 1945, although there are phases in there, and one could argue, as some people do, that really the Industrial Revolution shift started in the early 1800s, and then there's a major shift in around the 1870s with the significant increase in the use of fossil fuels. But if you look at the data from lots of different perspectives and lots of different disciplines, generally you can see a strong level of continuity between 1800 and 1945, driven by the Industrial Revolution as it rolled out in lots of different fields. And that was in terms of production and transportation and communication and energy, et cetera. Big shift after World War II, where the driving force became the information revolution. And that lasted until roughly 1945 to 1990, when 2 major events changed things. And one was the development of the digital age, and the other was the end of the Cold War. And most people do not recognize, in my opinion, how significant the dual effects of the 2 of those in combination. Because in essence, for about 55 years, much of the world, certainly the advanced portions of the world, held their breath and said, listen, we could destroy each other through nuclear holocausts. And there was a shifting. And when the end of the Cold War occurred, in combination with the digital revolution and the launching of the web and everything else, it transformed things since 1990, roughly, in ways that are significantly different and much more accelerated than what occurred in the 3rd phase. So if you look again at the history, this is how the application and development of human cyberneticity evolved over the last 500 years to produce more recognizably now what might be known as the Anthropocene. Within this process of the last 500 years, but especially over the last 50, 60 years, I'm particularly interested in major paradoxes. And the 2 meta paradoxes is that, for me, is best recognizing that human cyberneticity provides or is the critical forcing function in terms of how we got where we are today. You see these evolving and escalating human capabilities, but also evolving and escalating impacts. And these have positive and negative results. And one major paradox is what I would call the paradox of progress. It's a substantive changes that have occurred. So we've had over the last 500 years, dramatic increase in level of human prosperity, not only in terms of the degrees of prosperity, but the scope of how many people. Never have so many people had it so good on the species in terms of numbers, in terms of percentages, as they do right now in 2021, even after a relatively mild pandemic, if you take a look at what could have happened. But at the same time, in the same activities, we've been generating the prosperity, we've been generating significant problems. We've been redressing and resolving and improving a number of those problems, but now we're starting to run up against some of the limits of planet Earth, or spaceship Earth, as Bucky Fuller would call it. And that is a significant paradox, because in order to change the results, you've got to change what you're doing, and that's not easy to do. The second paradox is one of purpose. That is, we've had these increasing levels of autonomy, which has then breeded increased autonomy. So as we become more and more individually capable at the individual human biological level, but also within particular cultures and societies, you then start having this greater and greater interdependence of people basically saying, I am the boss of me. I don't want you telling me what to do. So all these issues that is closely tied to issues of human freedom, in terms of market relations and people having the freedom to make their choices economically and socially and politically, the freedom to move around, et cetera. So you start seeing then a balance or a relationship between autonomy and community. That is the greater collective good. And this tension within this paradox of purpose is really, really significant. So the purposeful activities are driving the progress activities, and they're both mutually amplifying. So as we built a better and better world in terms of progress with prosperity and problems, that's increased human autonomy and cyberneticity, but then that's then increased the levels of progress. And they are, not only are the relationships between the components within the two areas, progress and purpose, having a mutually amplifying relationship, but there is a mutually amplifying relationship between the purposeful activities and, quote, the progress that we're making. And again, I think this is what Gregory Bateson was starting to do in relatively early form in the late 1960s at that conference in Austria. So the meta issue, again, he called it conscious purposefulness, but this autonomy breeds autonomy, which leads to a tragedy of the commons. And I think we're all familiar with that, but I'm using the term tragedy of the commons, not limiting it just to the biological domain, but systemically. That when you have more and more people who are acting driven by their own enlightened self-interest, that works fine as long as you have unlimited room and unlimited resources. It doesn't work fine when there are limitations, and we're beginning to realize what some of those limitations are on planet Earth. And it becomes more and more difficult to get people to sacrifice or to control their own autonomy, their conscious purposefulness, when you start looking at the balancing of autonomy and community. So a final point, and this is much more looking forward, and I have not done as much work on this yet, but I think we're at the point now where we're trying to figure out how do we manage the Anthropocene. What I would emphasize, what I've said earlier, it's to me a complex mix of critical people and planet challenges, not just planet challenges. This is life in the Anthropocene is not just about climate change, species extinction, pandemics. It's also about people kinds of issues like economic inequality and political oppression and systemic racism. And they're all affecting each other in different ways. So one of the terms that I think is really become more popular now, it wasn't when I started using it in the early 70s, but the notion of the insanity trap, that people act the same way, they expect different results. We're at the point now where we've learned how to work well that produces this kind of progress and amplifies the progress. It's going to be very, very difficult to just keep doing what we're doing and modifying it slightly, but expect different results or better results. So in this case, I think I've had some discussions with Stu Umpleby and others over the years about this, but I think the law of records of variety is really, really significant. Not only because it reflects a scientific point that is comparable to F equals ma in physics, for example, but it's particularly relevant right here. If human beings are trying to figure out how we address the challenges and the opportunities involved in the Anthropocene, multidimensionally, as I've indicated, there are two basic strategies. And I found this appropriate in teaching, I found it in my consulting, but in essence, if you're in a situation where you're trying to deal with complex challenges in an environmental context, you have two basic sets of strategies. One is you can amplify your own capabilities, so you have better opportunities and the ability to handle whatever the challenges are and constraints that you want to address. The other is you can dampen those external challenges. And what human beings have generally liked to do, yes, we've been amplifying our capabilities, but we've also been trying to dampen the challenges. So we try to make the pandemic, the COVID virus and other things go away, as if it's a simple problem. You solve it, and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. But we're particularly adept and at dampening challenges that involve other human beings, because the conflicts and the tension is not just between humans and the planet, it's between humans and other humans. In fact, that's a large part of where most of our current tensions come from. And human beings have proven particularly adept at trying to limit the capabilities of other human beings to be able to exercise their autonomy and their freedom in constructive ways. So that leads to this tragedy of the commons, which highlights the need for collective action when we have increased autonomy and people are becoming more and more polarized in lots of different ways and no longer willing to engage in the kind of collective action that we did even recently, say during World War II or in other kinds of previous eras. 2 points I'd make closing, and then I'll be finished. One is that I think success in terms of moving forward is going to be an emphasis on managing the mess, as Russ Ackoff used to put it, not problem solving. It's not a question that we've got a well-defined problem, we solve it, we can move on to the next set of issues. We're not going to solve climate change. We're not going to solve systemic racism. These are messes that are highly complicated, very hyper complex in many ways, and they're going to require management. And we ought to be thinking not only about how do we prevent climate change pandemics, but how do we manage the messes when those kinds of things occur? How do we not just prevent people who disagree with us politically or socially or economically, but how do we manage it in such a way that we all can figure out a way to live on the planet? For me, I think cybernetics and system sciences are vital to that success for a whole bunch of reasons that I think I've tried to lay out here. So this is a relatively quick summary of sort of my perspectives on the nature of cybernetics and its relevance for the kinds of issues and distinctions that I find important. And in particular, on the central importance of human cyberneticity and the role of agency and autonomy, because they are, again, I still think, the most significant emergent capability or property in the known universe. And if we don't understand that capability better, we're not going to be able to figure out how to manage life and the future in the Anthropocene. So I'll stop there and turn it over to the next one. I hope it was relatively succinct and covering things, and happy to have discussion or questions either online or offline. Thanks.
Just one quick question, clarification here. When you say how do we, what is your perception of that we? I mean, club of Remy members or cyberneticians in general, or what do you mean by we? I mean,
For me, we is primarily humanity. What do we do?
So including everybody.
I'm including everybody. I think we're all on this planet Earth, a spaceship Earth. I think it's. I think if you wanted to change people's perspectives on things, get all the world's leaders in a submarine and take a ride around for a little bit, you begin to realize very quickly you got to keep everything in very, very finely tuned in order to stay alive in a very relatively closed system. But I also think the community that I'm interested in addressing, a community, in this case, of peers and colleagues who understand and care about systemic approaches and cybernetic approaches. But I also think that and I make a lot of effort to communicate with people outside this field. Most folks don't have any idea when you talk about cybernetics. When I first moved to California and people said, what's cybernetics? And I said it was about freezing dead people. And half the people said, really? And the other people said, no, it's not. Okay, so people still don't understand cybernetics. Very few people use it. And I'm talking experts in lots of other fields. I mean, I work a lot in national security. I work a lot in leadership and social, so various populations of other, what I would call experts, rather than the general public. I think it's really, really important to be able to communicate and share the valuable contributions that cybernetics and the system sciences can make. But it means we have to be able to communicate in ways that other people can understand. And that's our responsibility. That's amplifying our capabilities. Somebody turn off their mute. The other thing though, Jason, just is that if it's just a group of experts sitting around discussing how we can solve the world's problems, we're in deep trouble. Because this has got to be, I mean, it's difficult enough to getting a bunch of cyberneticians and system scientists to agree even what cybernetics and system science are and how they relate to each other. It's very difficult to get us to agree with other experts about common concerns. The gap between experts is nowhere near as great as the gap between experts and the general human population. But I think we've got to figure out how we help everybody on the planet, you know, begin to recognize what are the critical issues and what can we do about them while there's still some time to do it. So a lot of this is time-sensitive pressures, but enough. This is enough. This gives you sort of my take on, this is a project that I'm working on pretty intensively over the last couple of years. I'm working on a bunch of articles and probably a book will come out on it. But I thought it was relevant when Maurice raised the notion of meta-cybernetics. I also think it's particularly relevant to previous sessions we've had, and I'm remembering in particular discussions and contributions by Klaus and Larry Richards and Bernard and Lode, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I think the broader social dimensions are really important. So enough from me for now, and I take it over. Whoever's next, I think it's Maurice.
Hoda, do you have a quick question?
Yes, thank you. I will try to be quick on this one. Well, thank you very much for this presentation. I'm doing my PhD research on appreciating how to institutionalize systemic governance in the Anthropocene. So your topic is very much relevant to what I'm looking at as well. My question is about your framing of cybernetics when you engage with the idea or the concept of Anthropocene. And your framing is what, in my view, is a first order cybernetics framing, which is very relevant to the tradition from which the term Anthropocene emerged, which is Earth System Science. When Crutzen and Stormer in 2000 coined the term Anthropocene, it was definitely what you were describing. So when they speak of climate change and biodiversity loss and ocean acidification, and all these are the attributes that come out of this Anthropocene era, where, and I agree with you, it's about the interaction or the co-evolutionary dynamic between humans and the biosphere. So what we know through the term Anthropocene and through the tradition of Earth System Science that is focused on chemical, biological, and climatic disturbances due to human activities, it answers the what questions. The Anthropocene to me frames what is happening through these interactions. And the cybernetic concept here applies very much, the first order one. When I say second order, I mean the why question, the second order why question. What makes, for example, social reasons or social values, do we have CO2 increasing in the atmosphere? The Anthropocene framing answers how they happen. We know it's about industrial revolution, the great acceleration, definitely. And I think there is no contestation of the framing of the situation from an Earth System Science lens. The contestation, and if you are familiar with alternative framings like Capitalocene or Econocene, come from bringing another way to explain the situation and bringing a second order cybernetics view on it. So the Anthropocene will say, okay, humans are doing 1, 2, 3, and this is affecting the biosphere cycles. But then this second order view says, okay, but why are humans doing this? So I would like to have perhaps your view on these perspectives and what do you think of them?
That's a long question. Here you have a short answer.
I have a short answer that I recognize for people who are comfortable using first order and second order distinctions, that that tends to frame the way that they look at it. And I think an awful lot of the folks who have been working in the Anthropocene, in fact, it does reflect more of a first order perspective. I would argue that it's more of an ontological perspective. I think the key about second order cybernetics is it reflects a broader encompassing, but it tends to emphasize both an epistemological perspective, but also when you start getting into the axiological dimensions of it, and which I didn't address in here, because again, part of it is the framing of it. There are lots of ways that you can look at how human values and how they have been used and developed to rationalize, for example, or to implement ways of dampening one person's or one group's of autonomy and freedom to promote your own benefits of it. So you're looking at it from a why standpoint there. So from both an epistemological and an axiological perspective, I think it's really, really important to see what is the motivation that's affecting human beings, et cetera. But I also think it's important not to ignore the ontological aspects, that it's the human cyberneticity. Again, if you had people having their particular views of their values, but they weren't able to implement anything, they weren't able to organize things, they weren't able to engage in effective agency, that's not going to have much of an impact. So I fully embrace the importance of having a really rich understanding of the contributions that cybernetics can make to the evolution and development of the Anthropocene. And there are a lot of other people that are emphasizing, for some folks in one group, that I think the characterizations you made, Huda, were very basically fine, which is the folks that have been done most of the work on the Anthropocene are reflecting ontological distinctions about how we got where we are. And an awful lot of the people who are coming at it from the standpoint of social justice and other perspectives are emphasizing all the human motivations and everything else, and those are particularly good. I have not seen, and part of what led to this project that I'm working on, I have not seen anybody really emphasizing the significance, to me, the forcing function significance of human agency. That is, people take it for granted. So if you look at systems dynamics as one of the subfields, or if you look at network theory as one of the subfields within the system sciences, they explicitly presume that they're looking at interactions between purposeful systems. But they don't look at the nature of purposeful systems. So you can't reduce all of this to human cyberneticity and what happens in terms of agency. You have to look at the relationships between them and how they interact. And there are patterns of interaction as you go at the 50,000 foot level rather than the 10,000 foot level. And when you start getting into how we've seen both the history, the science behind human cyberneticity, and how it's been implemented historically, you start getting more and more into the kinds of questions that come up by second order cyberneticians and other people who don't even consider themselves second order cyberneticians, but are addressing similar kinds of concerns. Those are absolutely essential. What I wanted to lay out here was just a framework of some key distinctions to say, we can only make a certain amount of progress if we don't recognize the fundamental role of human agency as the driving force in what has happened on this planet. And the only place in the known universe we know that's happened. And that the science behind human agency and autonomy and the relationships between those, for me, is human cyberneticity. You can explain how it occurs and what it's done. And then when you start looking at the understanding the basics, you can then start pulling in now, to what extent do human values and the differences between cultures and how people treat people start developing a much richer human-centered focus on the Anthropocene, not a geological or a basic physical biological sciences focus. And I'd be happy to do another presentation down the road about where my work is on that, but I deliberately did not bring that in now. So, and is that enough for now on this?
Thank you. Perfect introduction to agency theory, Morris.
Thank you, William. I enjoyed that. Let me see if I can
call me Bill.
I have a question for Bill.
Yes, he's still here.
Still here.
Okay, Bill, I thank you very much for a very well articulated and well organized summary or overview of the axiology of your experience, which leads you to your present work. I found it to be both interesting and well informed. and certainly it ought to be influential. What my question, however, concerns the notion of your notion, or my understanding of your notion of forcing functions in this context. The nature of nature leads to the notion of the Anthropocene as a generating function as opposed to a forcing function. And this then leads to the question of the origin of your notion of paradoxes. It was very unclear to me how you see the paradoxes being related to a generating function as opposed to a forcing function.
How would you define forcing function?
Just, it's a physical term, mathematical physical term. Forces that actually cause effects, or if you want, within the domain of basically linear mathematics.
Okay, well, it's often used, at least within, when I first got involved with it with the Department of Defense and dealing with actual design of complicated systems, is there are factors that go into designing a particular situation or desired goal. It could be a technology, it could be a human system. And there are some functions within that that are more critical than others. So if you're, for example, designing a bridge, there are certain factors you have to address in order to be able to have a bridge that's going to work properly. And in some parts of the country, notably California, resistance to earthquakes of a certain magnitude and certain duration is a critical factor. It's a critical forcing function. If you don't design the bridge to be able to address that, it doesn't matter with anything else.
So basically you're saying that it's basically a physical phenomena that you're concerned with.
Well, it could be, at least in some cases, but I also think it's operational. So in the case, if you take a look at the origin, pardon me, if I take a look at characterizing where we are now in terms of human history and what we've achieved and where things are in the current condition on the planet, which I think is usefully, the best term available is Anthropocene, but it's not limited to the planet-centric kinds of concerns that originally gave rise to the term. There are all kinds of factors that led to it. I think it's been created by human beings. I think that's clearly understood. And I think it's manifested itself through our activities, our cybernetic activities and agency and acting. And if you're trying to take a look at what's happening with respect to the Anthropocene, the critical factor is human nature. But what people could, and human nature, to me, the most important aspect of it, it's not the only aspect. And if we had more time today, we could get into the psychological factors and the social factors and the cultural factors and look at how they've evolved over time. The most important feature that you got to pay attention to in understanding how the Anthropocene came to be is this cybernetic capability of human beings. And in all of and that generates conflicts. In other words, conflicts in terms of paradoxes. It generates paradoxes for me anyway. It's the best language I've found for being able, if you engage in a particular action, lots of actions have very positive consequences, such as increased prosperity, increased autonomy, et cetera. And the same actions have very negative consequences. And not in some cases, there's a significant gap between them. In some cases, you have large positive effects.
So, if I understand this correctly, then you're effectively saying that these are semantic paradoxes from your view, from your axiological perspective of nature, of the nature of being human, and that the syntactical notions that accompany semantics are of little concern when it comes to the forcing functions.
I don't know enough about semantics to be able to answer that question in ways that I think would be useful. I do think that there are real substantive differences. There are substantive differences in terms of prosperity and in terms of problems. I think there are systemic differences in terms of all the benefits that come from increased autonomy and agency, but also have the negative consequences of increasing the desire for more and more autonomy. So as people become more and more capable, become more and more prosperous, become more and more able to do what they want to do with their time, energy, resources, to live the lives the way they want to, both individually and collectively, that also generates more and more desire and more capability to say, I'm going to do what I want to do. So that has tremendous positive consequences with respect to our ability to run our own lives and personal freedoms, et cetera. But it also has real downsides when you start running into other people wanting to live their lives or choosing to live their lives in different ways.
Yeah, I think this is very well articulated. I appreciate how well you've articulated that basic tension between individuals in the community and the freedom of if you have wealth or capabilities. And so that part I don't have any questions on. I agree with you. Thank you.